Hey, y'all, and welcome to this episode of 1948 to Freedom. Today, we have someone that I'm very excited to introduce, Yaffa. Yaffa, thank you for being here with us. Yaffa, would you like to say hello to the people?
Hey, everyone.
Yeah, I'm really always, I'm honored anytime somebody gives me their time, just especially in the midst of, right, holding the duality of your own experience in the genocide that Palestinians are experiencing, and also, sharing your expertise and your energy and your soul with us. I'm deeply grateful that you're here. As y'all know, listeners, we'll give you the full blurby on Yaffa in the show notes. But within the context of this conversation, before we dive in, what would you like the people to know about you? Because I know there's so much to know, but just in this moment.
There's so much. I can keep going forever. But I think the most important things that I would like to highlight right now is that I'm a queer and trans indigenous displaced Palestinian. My displacement has been far and wide. My family has been displaced due to several different wars, both in Palestine and then the Gulf War. And then I was actually living in southern Syria when the Syrian Revolution started. And so have been in various different wars. I've lived in 9 countries. And currently I live out on Ohlone land, which is Oakland, California. And then professionally, I'm a death doula. I'm also the executive director of the Muslim Alliance for Sexual and Gender Diversity. So really centering queer and trans Muslims is a huge part of the day-to-day work that I do. And I'm also an artist. You actually did that very succinctly for how many things.
So before we get into, the work that you're really doing and how it intersects, with some of the conversation we had earlier and the artistry, I really want to touch on the fact that you said you've lived in 9 countries through several wars. And can I share your age?
Yes.
Okay. Within 31 years of life.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that I really want to drive this point home is because I think a lot of people have a misconception that, this just all started on October 7th. Like, right? There's so much context missing, unfortunately, for much of the West and specifically for Americans. Mm-hmm. And also just a general lack of understanding around what imperialism is, what settler colonialism is. Americans especially, and Canadians are only now starting in the last few years to grasp what that means due to, a wake up around indigenous folks here in the Americas, mm-hmm. and those conversations. But if you could speak a little bit to that, and also just to the reality of being a displaced Palestinian and a little bit of the context.
I love that you're starting with even just what is settler colonialism and having people start from there. In a lot of the conversations I've been having, when people are like, tell us about Palestine and the history of that. And I'm like, no, I need you to just learn what is settler colonialism and what is colonialism. Like, what are the differences between genocide and ethnic cleansing? I need you to go back to basics, right? Pretend mm-hmm. you're in the 5th grade and you're memorizing different definitions, because without that context, nothing makes sense. So I think for me, it's so interesting of how it's been different wars, and yet all of it is so interconnected. So like you mentioned, I'm 31 years old. And so I am the 3rd generation since this began, right? And so my grandparents were both born all 4 born in Palestine. So my dad's side are from Yaffa, my mom's side are from Jenin. Jenin is where the largest refugee camp exists, where there's currently a lot of attacks that are happening in the West Bank that aren't covered as much as Should be, probably. And then my dad's side, though, are from Yaffa. And Yaffa was one of the very first areas that was attacked and terrorized in a multitude of ways. I still remember very clearly, I think probably when I was around like 6 years old, and just having a random conversation with my grandmother. And she was like, I really wish that I had stayed in school longer. And I was like, oh, like, like, why did you not? And she was like, oh, because they would shoot us. And even at the age of 6, we understood that, right? We understood everything that was happening to our families and the displacement that we were experiencing. And so I don't share that to be like, oh, wow, look, as a 6-year-old, it was so traumatizing, because it really wasn't, right? Because we had known that, like, we woke up into consciousness knowing the struggle that we were a part of, right? And the injustice that had existed across the different generations. And it wasn't until later on that I learned a lot more of the history of that. Actually, Zionists at the time, this is before the state of Israel was created, this is before 1948, basically they would stay by schools and places similar to that to really terrify Palestinians, to get them to leave, right? And I just read something of that it was about 98% of the population in Yaffa that were forcibly displaced by 1948. And so my grandparents were part of that first generation. So their parents ended up moving, the vast majority of them ended up moving to Nablus, to the West Bank, but a few of them ended up moving to Gaza. And so some of my great uncles, I think 2 of them, ended up moving in their families into Gaza. They were a little bit older than the rest of my, and this is specifically my paternal grandfather's side, where they were a bit older, and so they went and settled there. And I tell people when they ask if I have family in Gaza, I'm like, I do, but we're distant. And what I mean by we're distant is that there's no way for us to go see them, and there's almost no way for them to come see us. Like, I've met one of those great uncle's kids, so one of my second cousins, once. But even just looking at like the list of the individuals who have been murdered in the last 3 weeks, right, who have been killed in this ongoing genocide, there's at least 20 to 30 names that I recognize, right, from just those families of people I've never met, of people who don't know me. And so that was kind of, unfortunately, the beginning of that displacement. Afterwards, they made it almost impossible to continue living in Palestine, making it illegal for Palestinians to be educated, for access to work. And so slowly, both sides of my family ended up moving to Kuwait, which is where my parents ended up being raised and where they grew up and ended up going to college, and then ended up meeting after college, and then ended up getting married. And then the Gulf War happened. And what most people don't realize after the Gulf War, even though you would think more people would know this, especially in what is known as the U.S., right? Because the U.S. was a part of the Gulf War, and yet most people don't realize that about 2 million Palestinians were expelled from Kuwait afterwards. And so I always tell people of, even before I was born, I was being expelled from a country into another. And so my parents moved for the very first time to Jordan, which is where I ended up being born. And since then, it just kind of continued. We ended up moving to Arizona for my dad to get his PhD. Education has been such a huge part of my family's legacy on both sides of the family, specifically because it was illegal, because you were going to get shot if you went to school. And so the vast majority of family members, at the very, very, very least, have a bachelor's degree. Most have PhDs or masters. And even between me and my sisters, we're highly educated in that way, but less because it's, oh, we really want this piece of paper, and more of like, this is part of our resistance. This is part of our legacy as Palestinians, and honoring my grandparents who couldn't continue that education. And then ended up moving after 9/11. It's interesting, with everything going on, it almost feels a lot like how it felt right after 9/11. And I was only 9 years old when 9/11 happened. And yet I still remember it so clearly in terms of how people were reacting to us. Although I always tell people of our mosque in Arizona was vandalized 2 weeks before 9/11 and vandalized 2 weeks after, to really highlight of like, this wasn't new. People in Arizona were mistreating us way longer than that, but it really changed everything in the sense of, prior to 9/11, we used to go to protests for Palestine, for Ireland, for Kashmir, for so many areas around the world. We were constantly at protests. We were constantly organizing and doing things. Like, I remember being 6 and being on the streets, right? And carrying a flag that's bigger than me, and then being 7 and not even knowing like how to pronounce like things like Kashmir, right? Or really understanding what Ireland is, and so on and so forth. And yet, but we were always there. We were constantly showing up for other people. And then 9/11 happened and people disappeared, right? Like, community members just started disappearing. The FBI talked to almost everyone. The FBI came to our house, right? I, being a 9-year-old, was talking to them with my mom. And this feels a lot like that. But due to all of that, we ended up moving to Canada afterwards, which unfortunately was not better in any way, shape, or form, unfortunately, right? I wish I could be like, yeah, Canada was so much better and we were treated so much nicer, but that literally was just not the case. It was very much the same thing, except now we didn't have the community that we had built over a few years. And so we ended up moving back to Jordan, again, basically for the second time, where my grandparents had settled by then. And then as I got older, right, when I was 17, I left home, ended up moving to southern Syria, North Jordan, and then went to college in Massachusetts, lived in Switzerland for a bit, went back to New England, lived in Hong Kong, lived in Malaysia, lived in Turkey, more in New England, lived in Northern Ireland the last couple of years, and now back here. And, you know, whenever folks ask of like, you know, where are my sisters and things like that, I'm like, which ones? Right? Because we're also scattered all over the world. My aunts are uncles are scattered all over the world. My cousins are scattered all over the world. And that's just kind of the legacy of that displacement. And I've always actually had a challenge with like even saying I'm like part of the diaspora, because I feel like even saying you're part of the diaspora claims roots to where you've settled. And we've never had that. I don't really have that here. So I, like so many others, right, feel like it's just to the next place potentially and the one after it, until we're able to go back home.
Can I take us back to something you said, because I really want this point to land with people. Absolutely. You said that you were distant from family because you couldn't go there and they couldn't come here. And I think that's really, that I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit more in detail, because I don't think that people fully grasp, right? Even when you're saying like, I don't know that I consider myself part of the diaspora because I don't have roots, right? There is no sovereignty in the reality that any oppressed people experience, right? But specifically Palestinians.
Yeah.
Right? There's no sovereignty in that. So it's not like, oh, we just didn't talk to family. Because I think that people be like, oh yeah, they're distant because they're on the other side of the world. Like, no, there were very intentional policies in place. And so if you could speak to that a little bit more for people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think most people don't realize that Palestine, or Palestinians in particular, do not control any borders. We don't control any of them. So Gaza, the borders are either controlled by what is known as Israel or Egypt. Mm-hmm. The West Bank, even though it borders Jordan, the border is patrolled by Israeli armed forces. It's not controlled by people in the West Bank. So wherever those family members are, without any kind of like global North passport, there's almost no way to go and potentially even visit. It's hard enough in the West Bank, let alone Gaza, right? Where Egypt and Israel will almost never let you in without a global North passport. And even then, the chances of them not letting you in are so large, right? Even going on like a humanitarian aid force or on a volunteer trip or whatever it is so hard for you to get inside of there. And so for us being so displaced and constantly hopping around, the passport I currently carry is a Jordanian passport. With a Jordanian passport, it is impossible to enter Gaza. It is almost impossible to enter the West Bank, right? And so And with people living in Gaza in particular, it is almost impossible for them to leave. The only times they have been able to leave is usually whenever there's been large-scale medical crisis. And then every once in a while, Egypt will let them out, or otherwise they have to wait years. And usually most will die before a permit comes in from Israel, right? And so for us not being there and them being there, with us not being global North citizens and not them, again, not being able to ever leave, it's almost impossible to go and actually visit one another. I always tell people one of the differences between Palestine and a lot of other places is that for a lot of other places, you can go and die in your homeland. What I tell people is that we can't go to die in our homeland. It's not about that our lives are in danger once we cross a border. It's literally that we can't cross that border, which is very different than a lot of other places. A lot of other places, your life is in jeopardy once you go back home. But for us, we can't go back home to die, to be killed, right? To be a part of this. And I think a lot of people don't really recognize those things. And so in terms of the Gaza family members and even the West Bank, that distance just gets built over generations, right? So these are my grandfather's siblings. And so when my grandfather was alive, he would call them every once in a while. They would call us every once in a while. We would talk, and we were close in the sense of like, we know each other a little bit here and there, right? With the older generations. But that's kind of it, of like, okay, this person has so many kids, right? The kids are doing this. This person got married. Just those high level updates. But generation after generation, that distance gets larger and larger. And so my grandfather used to talk to his siblings until one of them died from natural causes. And I believe the other is still alive, potentially at this point. I don't know.
Yeah.
And my grandfather knew all of the kids. My dad knows some of those kids. Some of my dad's siblings know more of those cousins. But as it trickles down to me, or now with my sister's kids don't know anything about that, right? Even one of my younger sisters, and this was so heartwarming when it happened about a week ago, where she messaged me, and she's 23. She was born in the US. So she was born in Arizona. And she messaged me and she was like, can I have a conversation with you about our family in Palestine? Because I don't know that history. Yeah. And so it's beautiful that people are remembering things and we're not losing that with generations. But just inherently, when you force people apart, when all the systemic barriers to not be able to, not even just see each other, but even calling into Gaza, right? Where it was like astronomical costs, right? For people there and for people calling and things like that, of just over time, right? People move forward and live their lives, and we know they're there. They know we're here. Well, I don't know if they know I'm here, right? But they know that my parents are in Jordan. They know that we're always connected. And also, we're all dreaming of the day when we get to physically be reconnected on the land that is ours.
Yeah. Before I ask the next question for the listeners, I really want them to understand that everything that you're talking about, right? The barriers to entry and exit, the need for permission, those are examples of Israel being an apartheid state, because there's a lot of pushback and there's a lot of games being played with language to try to lessen the political atrocities that absolutely have been what I call a very intentional, slow and steady genocide, right? Leading up to, this particular escalation. And so that is a perfect example. I know that's been a hard one for people to fully grasp because, that's, unless you're familiar with all of the policies and exactly what it means to be an apartheid state, that can be hard. But that is an example of the government known as Israel being an apartheid state.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for sharing all of that context with us. I think it's really important for people to understand that. I would love if we could shift gears just a little bit. because I have so many things I want to talk to you about, but I want to make sure we create enough space. So a lot of your work, obviously aside from being an artist, which we'll talk about, and the creative side of you, but a lot of your work is really rooted in supporting and providing resources and healing, and we were talking about before, right, somatic healing to people, and specifically to queer and trans Muslims. So first, I want you to talk a little bit about your work and the importance of that. And then I've got a couple follow-ups, but I'll let you start there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been working with queer and trans Muslims since, I want to say, about 2016. And at first it was just through my peer support practice. So I'm also a peer support specialist, and that's kind of how I got into death doula work, birthing doula work. And at the time, I realized that there was nobody supporting specifically trans unaccompanied minors coming in from Syria. And they were literally children, right? Usually between the ages of 12 and 16. And they were coming to this new country. They were queer and trans, and they had no other Muslim community around them. And by Muslim, I don't necessarily mean like a religious practice. I'm talking about the cultural, the racial, the nationalistic elements of everything that could fit within that. And so I would qualify like Palestinian like Christians as a part of that, right? Like it's really that proximity versus a practice, but realizing of like they had no one, right? They were working with only individuals within the broader medical system and the mental health system who were actively really Islamophobic at the same time. And so recognizing that, I kind of just accidentally started doing that work and would support individuals one-on-one. And it took a really long time outside of that to actually find any kind of queer and trans Muslim community. The vast majority of us have never actually met anyone else around us who's also queer, trans, and Muslim. There's this complete like erasure of our identities, and even to this day, there's still an erasure of that we exist, that these identities can intersect, and that they do exist. And that erasure happens from every pathway, from just everybody, more or less, within the LGBTQ community, largely, right, within some of the Muslim community, within other religious communities, just across the board, that erasure is always there. And so it wasn't until I found out about MASGD, the Muslim Alliance for Sexual and Gender Diversity, which has been around since 2011, and really just started as a space for queer and trans Muslims and their partners to come together. And it started just as a yearly retreat, and slowly it kind of grew. And the last time they did it, it had, I believe it was over 170 people coming to this retreat. Since COVID began, they moved everything virtual. And that was kind of when I became more involved with MASGD, just first as a participant, and then about a year and a half ago, became the executive director of MASGD as the first executive director that's been hired by the organization. And I like to mention that because we are an organization that is for and by the community. So everyone who's a part of MASGD is also a participant in MASGD, versus it's individuals who don't identify with those identities kind of coming in and being like, well, what do queer and trans Muslims need? Right? What do y'all want?
Tell you.
Exactly, because we are the community, right? We're living this every day, and so within MASGD, a lot of my role over the last year has been to support sustaining programming, kind of expand and elevate the different things that previous folks had built. So many incredible folks have been a part of MASGD over the years. And so they had built such a beautiful foundation. It was really just a matter of expanding programming and the reach, and just really making sure that we're supporting queer and trans Muslims in the ways that they need to. And one thing that we've been building that we're just announcing now actually is due to our recognition that we were expecting next year to be the horrible year, right? As we move closer to the election, we were expecting the ramp up to Islamophobia to happen then, right? The ramp up in anti-Semitism, the ramp up in queerphobia and transphobia and everything. We did not realize that 2023 was also going to be that year. And so we are looking at potentially expediting some programs that we were hoping to launch mid next next year. But two of the major things that we're launching is both case management and then specifically a queer and trans Muslim helpline, where queer and trans Muslims would be able to receive support immediately instead of having to wait long wait times between programs or potentially having to access different services within the behavioral health system that are not really equipped to support us in a lot of ways, and also don't know how to support us quickly, especially considering that the vast majority of our community don't have access to generational wealth. They don't have access to even things like health insurance a lot of times. And the amount of times just this year that individuals will either, I will reach out to them and just check in and be like, hey, how are things going? Or someone will just randomly check in and just let it slip of the amount of times that people have been harassed and assaulted just over the last few months. Even before all of this has happened, we've seen an enormous uptick over the last 3 weeks. But even for things like that, being able to just access a phone number, right, and have access to somebody, and it's going to be a peer-run helpline, so it's not a space where you're going to come and like access therapy and things like that. But most people just need another person who gets it. And that's what we're hoping that we'll be able to do with that. So initially, our plan was to launch that in May. I'm currently working on getting funding so that it launches earlier, potentially, especially with everything going on. Like, we needed this 3 weeks ago. So the sooner we're able to do that, the better. But we're also really intentional. If we're an organization that has a no volunteer policy, our community does not have access to wealth. And so recognizing that, we don't feel like it's equitable to ask people to volunteer on this while they themselves are really struggling. And so we want to fully staff it, which is where, again, we're doing some fundraising efforts. I'm trying to get more grants and things like that to really be able to build this out properly, but really hoping that we can launch that soon. But outside of that, a lot of our spaces are really just bringing folks together, having spaces of belonging. We'll also do intensive skill building series. So we've done like transformative justice skill building. And we just went back to our retreats again. So we had a smaller retreat this year of about 15 people. And that was really beautiful I think for a lot of people to just experience the joy of like what's possible when you're in physical proximity to one another versus just behind a screen. And we're trying to be really careful of how we build that out, considering COVID is still very much real, but also at the same time, how do we make it as accessible as possible for individuals? So this past year, we actually did it entirely free for our participants, instead of asking people to potentially apply for scholarships and do additional layers. That to us are just very anti-poverty because they just add more labor for folks who need the money most.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to circle back to MASGD and how everyone can support, because I think it's super important. And so, this is something that I personally spend a lot of time thinking about, is the intersections of weaponization. Because I grew up with, in a Muslim household with parents who were like, Islam is love. And, very like non-intersectionally weaponized, right? It was just Islam is love, which means queer, straight, trans, like it doesn't matter. Like, it is not our place to judge. You are to love everyone, support everyone, like so on and so forth. And naturally, unfortunately, the way that white supremacy and different layers of oppression and dominance operate, right? The additional layers of marginalized identity that can be weaponized against you, the way that our society works, unfortunately, they will. And so I say all of that because I have community members that know that I was raised like that, right? And so I feel honored to be a safe space. But in that safety, what I'm hearing from them is that right now in this moment, not just my, Arab and Muslim like siblings, but specifically Palestinian queer and trans folk right now are sharing with me the bothness of we are completely being erased in the conversation right now, but somehow simultaneously also our identities being weaponized for justifications, right? So it's like, we don't matter. This is literally what I'm told. We don't matter unless we can be a weapon for you. And so I would love for you to elaborate on that and speak to that, because I think we need to be having more conversations around that publicly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say, I definitely want to encourage people to really look into some of the history of things like pinkwashing, even the history of queerness in Palestine. There are some really great resources out there. And I kind of want to start with the reality of that pre-1948, queerness was alive and well in Palestine, same with transness. And so my grandparents, on my dad's side in particular, are probably the first two to really know that I was queer and trans. Right. And for us to be having conversations of like, yeah, they're like, yeah, we had that queer neighbor. Right. Like, and it's just so normal. Right. So to them, for me to be like, oh, yeah, like, let's sit down. Let me tell you about this because this is a big deal. They would just be like, what are you talking about? Like, what? But like, okay, I guess I also had food for breakfast. Like, are we just sharing?
Yeah.
Like they legitimately would not get it. And it's interesting of thinking of that, of like my grandparents' generation that grew up pre-1948, right? That were born at pre-1948 and honestly, really, even though the British had colonized Palestine, there was so much resistance to it that they actually did not adopt a lot of the culture that was coming in that was going to be homophobic and transphobic in the same way that places that had been colonized for hundreds of years would have. And so that generation was the most accepting of people, right? They understood things in a way that even today people struggle with, right? We talk about how the younger generation gets it. And I'm like, but have you met people before? Like pre-colonization? Like I love people in their 90s. Like, let's go there. Because it's like, I feel like nowadays, a lot of the younger generation, they get things, but they get things through understanding things. Whereas back then it was, I just get you. You're just a human. Everything that you are is valid. I don't need to know all these identities. I don't need to understand anything because we're in community. We're here. We're going to be here. There's nothing that you can do that will make me ever not want to be around you. And that's my parents, the way my parents are now, of like, there's nothing that any of us as their kids could do that, whether they understand it or not, they're like, you're our kids. Like, we will love you forever. We will always want you in our lives, period. There are no ands, buts, or anything else. There are no stipulations. There just is. But I will say, of when I was younger and kind of thinking about this, I did see a huge difference between my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation. So my parents' generation are the ones that were born into war. They were born into war first in Palestine, and then war grew up into adulthood, right, in another war with the Gulf War, right, and then were displaced across the globe. And in a lot of ways, for them, they started viewing a lot of these differences, like quote unquote differences, as white, right? Of that these are a result of whiteness versus actually this is just human, but because white supremacy has sent the message of that white supremacy is all of these things and only white supremacy is those things, actively harming us in the process. And so I have noticed that my parents' generation, they're the ones that are less likely to just inherently understand these things. From my experience, they usually do. Eventually, it's just not the same, right? Because again, they were taught that this is a white thing. And so there's almost this confusion of like, wait, but you're not white. Like what happened? Like, did we do something wrong? Like, is it because of whiteness? And people hear that as like them being really homophobic and transphobic, which is very fair. And also at the same time, it's really that anti-white supremacy that they're bringing forward, but where they don't really have a comprehensive idea of white supremacy, right? Where it becomes much more intersectional. And so I always like to start there of that Palestine has always been queer and trans friendly, right? And it's actually everything that's happened in the last 75 years that's actually moved it away from that. And then in terms of the weaponization, even the US and European countries and Canada and places like that, as a trans person, it is actually almost impossible to immigrate to any of those countries because transness is still seen as a disability. And if you are disabled, you are barred from immigration to all those places. The only exception is if you fit within a specific narrative that they want, where they could be the saviors, then you could be an asylee or potentially a refugee at times and say, white people, please save me. And then they're like, okay, maybe cute. But outside of that, if you do not fit that narrative, you're actually just continuously actively punished, right? And I think about that, like within even my family and as a writer and things like that, of like, if I wanted to publish a book to talk about how Islam is transphobic or something like that, and how horrible my family is, and how I had to fight for my life and I was displaced because of my queerness and transness, I'd be getting book deals left and right.
Oh my God, you'd be so wealthy.
Oh my God, I would have so many Netflix documentaries and 100%. Everything. Like I would just have everything,
you
right?
You would be popping.
Right. But to come at it from like, actually, yeah, my parents are cute.
Yeah.
Like, we're good. Yeah, my grandparents were also good. I've never had to come out because it was just cute. It was fine. Just started talking about it and people were like, okay, cute, we're good. Like this whole idea, this narrative, right, has really been like, it's been imported to the rest of the world, right, and has really like set in, unfortunately, even within a lot of queer and trans people who don't live in global north countries, where in their heads right now, white people will save them because that's where things are good. And so as this is happening and people send me all kinds of messages being like, oh my God, Hamas will kill you, right? Or your people are going to kill you and all of that kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, cute. Like, do you actually care? One, you really don't. But two, I've never received a death threat from any Muslims, from any of my people. I've only ever received death threats for my queerness and transness from white people. Only. Exclusively white people, right? But that's really that weaponization. And I will say is that Israel has also used those same tools, right, to create that same narrative where if you're in Gaza, right, and you say as a trans person you're terrified of Gaza, they will take you, they will parade you, they will do an entire media campaign to show how they saved you, quote unquote, when the only people you needed saving from were them, because they are the ones that put you in those conditions. And I will say of queer and trans Palestinians in Palestine, whether in Gaza or most predominantly in the West Bank, have been putting out resources around pinkwashing for years. They have shared everything that needs to be shared. There's nothing that I can add to that conversation. And my question to everyone is, where have you been all of those years? Because this isn't the first time that you've heard of it. We have been telling people who are like, I'm going to go to Tel Aviv Pride. And we have been sharing it. It gets shared every single Pride season. It gets shared throughout the year and again and again and again. And yet now, as an ongoing genocide is happening, you want to weaponize our identities, right, to justify that this is why the 8,000 people who have been murdered had to die. So I would rather be in the closet and bring back the 30 family members I've lost in the last 3 weeks. Like, the closet is fine. I don't mind. Like, I don't know what the closet is like. However, I don't care. Right. Yeah. But like, we want our independence, right? Like, we want to be home. We will figure out our shit. That's ours. It's none of your business.
And that's what I was going to say is this, I don't even know what to call it, right? It's this very gaslighty weaponization and narrative because you don't care. Like, let us be clear. You do not care. Like, obviously, we're watching that happen. And also, it's not your problem, right? If you were to give Palestinians back their homeland and liberate them and give them their freedom and their safety, it's still not your problem, right? Like, let communities manage themselves, because prior to whiteness and settler colonialism, indigenous communities have a number of practices and a number of systems in place to manage ourselves globally. Mm-hmm. Then y'all came in and for lack of a better term, fucked it up, right? Like, y'all destroyed our indigenous practices and our communal ways of being globally.
Yeah.
Right? And so specifically for Palestinians, I just really want to make the point for people that it's not your business. If you're not Palestinian, you don't get a say in how Palestine or Palestinians, quote unquote, police themselves. Like, your concern should simply be, what am I doing to ensure that they are free enough and have the sovereignty to be able to police themselves? That's
Absolutely. And I do want to just add one more layer to all of this that I find rarely gets mentioned, and most people don't know this. So I received my master's in conflict transformation and social justice a couple of years ago, I guess. It's why I was living in Northern Ireland. And one of the areas of research that I was doing was around like women, peace, and security, and a lot of the work there. And one thing that a lot of people don't realize is, and this goes kind of a little bit back, right? So this goes pre-Trump. So this goes into the Obama era. So during Obama's presidency, 2 different women, peace, and security resolutions were passed in the United States. During the second one, it was the first time in the US that they kind of shifted the narrative a little bit. So prior to that, with like the Bush administration and things like that, if folks remember, women's safety was used as a justification for invading Afghanistan and Iraq, right? And that had been happening for a while. And what happened with that second Women, Peace, and Security resolution with the Obama administration is that they changed it to be that women can also be perpetrators and not just victims. And in particular, and this was actually really disgusting, and I really wish more people would talk about this. In particular, it was shared within the countering violence extremism section of that, which for people who don't know countering violent extremism, that is specifically a predominantly youth, Muslims of color, predominantly Black Muslims, surveillance program that was started in England and then adopted in the US. And so specifically framing it as Muslim women can also be perpetrators. And then in addition to that, they didn't just leave it at that. They introduced that now the people that need saving are the LGBTQ community members, specifically in the global South. And if you listen to Trump's election speech, one of the very first ones, the one that he did in Arizona, where he called people a lot of different things, where it was incredibly violent. Trump actually used the exact same words to specifically say that we need to go and invade these countries. I don't remember if that was the one where he called all of us shithole countries or if it was another one, but he specifically made the case to invade us to save the LGBTQ community. This is Trump we are talking about, but it was the exact same language, right? And so seeing how it's weaponized now, it's just kind of part of that same legacy where realized, oh, wait, actually, we can't use women as justification to continue invading all of these countries. People are starting to wake up to that. Let's do all of this other stuff. And for me, I don't think it's any kind of coincidence or accident that there's a rise in anti-trans bills. I think there were over 500 introduced this past year in the United States because they all go hand in hand, right? And so you could be both transphobic here and also say that you're trying to save trans people by invading a country. And that's generally what's happening. So it's layer upon layer upon layer of gaslighting. And I really wish more people knew some of like those pieces of it, because then you go into like the UN resolutions and how they've upheld so many of those things. But I'll stop there because I can go on and on about that topic.
No, but I think that's really, really important because people don't understand really, even with the beginning, right, with Bush and the Patriot Act, like people don't understand how, like they hear generally about these policies and generally what they're quote unquote supposed to be for and supposed to mean. But unless you're sitting down and really reading the policy and the language of it, and they're very intentionally written with like enough precision, but also enough vagueness. So like we can really use them to do whatever we kind of need to at any given time. Right. And, you know, I have a family member who works in policy and jokes all the time. He was like, they literally write this stuff so that the average person who hasn't studied like policy writing XYZ is so confused that they just kind of hands off and they're like, okay, whatever, like not my monkey, not my circus, right? And we're seeing all of the impacts of that reality right now in Palestine. And so I think it's an important note. And for everybody listening, again, I always tell y'all, while misinformation and disinformation is rampant, Google is still free. And so if you learn the discernment, if you use the discernment lenses that I at least have been teaching you to use over the last few years and make sure that you are vetting your resources, you can find all of this information and and there are tons of people who have taken the time to translate it into digestible kind of everyday speak so that you can better understand it. And so that even now, when you are continuing to call for a ceasefire and call your representatives, you can start to understand the language to use and understand how language is being weaponized, you know, and all of those things. So super important. Yes, there's probably a whole episode on that alone that we could come back and do. But with the time we have left, I want to take another pivot, if that feels okay, because this is something that's really important to me generally, but also specifically within what I'm calling the liberation movement for Palestine, right? Because this is not a new movement. It is 75 years old. So I recently posted about the history of the usage of the watermelon. And art as resistance, you know, within the Palestinian liberation movement. And I know you have a book of poems coming out on the 13th of November called Blood Orange, and I'll let you speak to that a little bit more. But if you could just expand on that, right? Art as resistance specifically for Palestinians and the importance of art within the community, and then also a little bit about, you know, your book and where the inspiration for the poems came from and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I feel like art has always been a huge part of the Palestinian liberation movement, even prior to the last 75 years with the Arab Revolution, right? As we were trying to get rid of the British in the 20s. Yeah. And so on and so forth. And it's been a huge part of every single struggle around the world. And the cool thing with art is, depending on the medium that you're using, is that it's so easily transferable between causes. And so you could create like visual media for Palestine, but actually it's so relevant to potentially what's happening in Sudan, right? Mm-hmm. Or potentially what's happening in Armenia, or what's about to happen in Haiti, and has been happening in Haiti or in the Congo. Mm-hmm. It's so easily transferable, and it's almost as if one of your own people from there created it, even though they could be potentially thousands of miles away. And I've always viewed art as like that across different mediums. So most of my art comes out in writing. So I've been a novelist since I was 13. In a different nonprofit that I had founded and run for a few years called Life in My Days, I actually built an online social change platform where folks from around the world would just share their different experiences, and I would support them to share in a way that promotes healing and growth. Mm-hmm. And the most beautiful pieces of that were, like, there was this one time, the last one that I remember is this person in his 80s in Malaysia reached out and was like, oh, I just read this last article that was written, and I connected so much to it. Mm-hmm. And at the time, it was written by a 16-year-old living in Jordan.
Oh, wow.
Right. And neither of them knew that, right? Like, it within that bio, it wasn't listed like this person is 16, right? This person was fully anonymous and stuff. And just, so for me, art is so powerful in those ways where we could be talking about all of those things, but sometimes it's reading something or looking at something or having something described to you or listening to music from an area that's actually what's going to open your heart and make this make sense. All of a sudden it's like, oh wait, this makes sense. So I definitely want to encourage people to really explore art and all kinds of art. Of like, if you love music, check out Palestinian music. Don't appropriate it. I know some people really like to do that. Don't appropriate our art. However, just be within it, right? And know how much of it was lost along the way. But also of like reading things from 75 years ago or even longer than that in the Arab Revolution period is applicable today. Like you almost cannot tell that it was written 80 years ago, 90 years ago. It feels as if I just wrote it 2 weeks ago. And something that I wrote 2 weeks ago feels as if it could have been 70 years ago. Like that's how long this struggle has been. And so art in a way allows us to connect across generations with long experiences instead of focusing on like, okay, well, your experience is this, my experience is that. And so we must be so different. And in reality, it's like, no, displacement is displacement. And I've been really thinking about this I have a poem in the new collection called, I believe it's called Southeast or Southwest. It's one of those, but it basically reflects on how some of the family went Southeast and some went Southwest. And how that's shifted everything. Like my family was the one that went Southwest to Kuwait. Other family went Southwest to Gaza, Southeast to Kuwait, right? And how just that movement, just a single moment in time, changed our families for generations. And so to me, that's really the beauty of art. So with Blood Orange, the title pays homage to the Yaffa oranges, so my family's from Yaffa. I'm named Yaffa. And so really wanted to bring more of just me into that. And the watermelon is such a beautiful symbol of resistance. For Yaffa in particular, oranges for us would be a big deal because the oranges were appropriated first by the British, right? They were stolen from us then, and then, right, reappropriated again by the settler colony of Israel. And yet we still remember it, right? Even though most people don't know that connection anymore. Like I've lived in the UK, like they'll call them Jaffa oranges, and they won't connect that they're talking about Yaffa, they're talking about Palestine. And so I really wanted to have a name that symbolized that while still honoring the genocide that's currently happening. And writing this book was really interesting because it's always been the hardest for me to write about Palestine. Whether poetry or writing novels, whatever it is, it's always been hardest to write about home. And yet, as this was unfolding over the last few weeks, it was so easy to write this book. This collection's about 32 poems, and I wrote them within a weekend. And they were just perfect as they came out. They were ready for the world. And at the time, the reason I decided to publish this is because I really wanted to do something to, one, raise awareness around those intersects of being queer, trans, and Palestinian. And even beyond that, just talk to the experience of being Palestinian, of being displaced, of the multitude of different things that we experience. And also, I wanted to find a way to really raise some funds for queer and trans Palestinian work that's happening and queer and trans Palestinians on the ground, where right now we're seeing a lot of money going directly on the ground to a lot of the medical services and the humanitarian aid, which is absolutely beautiful. I definitely want to encourage people to still donate. And also at the same time, to not forget that queer and trans Palestinians exist everywhere. Like queer and trans Palestinians are dying in Gaza, they're dying in the West Bank, they're being displaced again and again and again. And also we're out here in the diaspora. And because of the intersect that we live with, we have so many systemic barriers in the first place. Right. So, and this just adds more to it with Islamophobia. And so queer and trans Palestinian artists are losing art shows because of the rise in Islamophobia. They're potentially losing their community spaces, their art gallery spaces, even the community space that I've done some sessions at, which is co-owned by a queer Palestinian. They don't have rent in December. And so I really wanted to raise some funds to be able to have some access to additional funds to be able to support some of these spaces. And then even just build out more of the check-in spaces that we need as queer and trans Palestinians for just our own survival as we go through this. I think a lot of people don't realize, and I would love to I just want to really name this directly, because I haven't really heard many people naming this directly. I would give up anything to be able to go die in Gaza today, right? To be on the ground. Like I would rather die there potentially than live from such a distance, right? And not be able to die with my people. right, for the causes that I believe in, for justice in every sense of the word. And so the weight that we carry, right, as people outside of that, right, that survivor's guilt for so many people is so real and so profound. And it's so critical right now versus like a year from now to really have those conversations, to recognize how to reset our nervous system so that this doesn't become our new normal, right? To be able to process all the grief that we're carrying, to be able to get to a place where we're actually honoring all of the emotions going through us versus really like allowing survivor's guilt to move us away from that. And I'll share just one final thing as a story for that. A few years ago in the same organization that had the online social change platform, Life in My Days, we were doing some mental health work in Jordan at the time. And every event that we did, someone asked about suicide. And so we ended up hosting the first suicidality summit potentially in the region. I don't know if anyone else has done another one. But at the time, this was 2017, 2018, I think 2017. And even us as organizers did not realize that Jordan has the highest rate of death by suicide amongst any countries in the region. And people were shocked by this. And to an extent, we sort of were too. And literally a few days later, I was meeting with another organizer from the West Bank who's able to go back and forth between Jordan and the West Bank. And we were talking about it. And she was like, that makes total sense. She's like, for us, when someone dies, we all grieve together. She's like, whether we know the person, whether we don't, we're all going to cry. We're all going to show up. We're going to feed each other. We're going to show up 100% of the time. And when something wonderful happens, like someone gets married, a child is born, whatever it is, someone graduates, whatever it is, she's like, we all celebrate, whether we know each other or not. We are going to go all out. Like we're going to do a week-long wedding just because. And she's like, but then I cross the border and I come to Jordan, and she's like, here they don't process anything. She's like, when you have something positive happening, you think to yourself that you're not allowed to really embrace the celebration because people are dying across the border. And she's like, when someone dies, you think it's not horrible enough because we're being killed and murdered in other countries. And so she's like, you all don't honor the emotions that happen when a child is like, I have a problem. Their parents usually will be like, well, your cousins are dying, right? And just shuts it up. And I really don't want to see that happen to people wherever they are in the world, right? But that's where we're going to go. We know that's the path that we go on. And so really wanted to raise some funds to be able to address some of that specifically for the queer and trans Palestinian community, so that we're able to have those conversations for people to just know that actually, like, go, and if you're about to get married, go get married, like have the biggest wedding, right? Like if Palestine is going to be free tomorrow, I would maybe tell you wait until the day after, but we don't know that, right? So celebrate everything, mourn everything, and also recognizing if most of us don't have any of those spaces to do that with community. And so really hoping that we're able to raise some funds with this to be able to really do that.
And so again, so the proceeds from Blood Orange are going to go towards that. And I mean, I'm just having my own moment listening, because I think that we forget about how impactful art really can be to connect us. I think a lot of times, to your point, especially if we come from a people that has experienced a similar struggle, and we've have distance from it, or maybe we've gotten our liberation, then we're like, oh, I'm okay now, right? But I really encourage everybody, especially people that if you have any ancestrally, right, you have this similar struggle, being able to connect, like you said, to, whether it's your poems, whether it's the music, whether it's I love the story of the watermelon, because it was like, oh, word, even a watermelon? Bet, watch, right? Or the blood oranges. it reminds you how human you are, and it allows you to connect to the humanity of a people that maybe you are, you don't belong to those people, but you share a struggle. And I think that is such an important piece that's missing when we're talking about liberation, is that I actually, I'm to your point of like celebrating big, mourning big, all the things. I'm very lucky to know a lot of Palestinians, but I don't need to know a single one. None of us should it shouldn't be a requirement for connecting to this struggle and fighting for this, right? The liberation of Palestinians, or like you said, or the Sudanese, or the Afghan population in Pakistan right now, or in the Congo, or in Yemen, or any of the things that are happening, right? Connecting to your humanity, and then through art allowing you to connect to another person's humanity, is such a beautiful process. And I really, really want to encourage everybody, if you do nothing else right after listening to, like immediately after listening to this episode, go find a piece of art, right? A piece of music, and just allow yourself to connect. Because even in the music, you don't have to understand the language, right? You can hear the emotion, you can feel it, and let yourself connect in that way. That being said, I want to circle back just before we wrap up. How can we support MASGD?
So in terms of supporting MASGD, the best ways to support MASGD is really to just follow us to begin with. So you can go on our website and sign up for the newsletter. So it's just themasgd.org, or follow us on Instagram, where we share about all the events that were happening. If you have access to financial means, if you're able to make a donation, your donation goes a long way to be able to create a lot of these programs and make sure that we're showing up in the ways that we would love to for our community. And you could find all of those links online or on Instagram. You could, if you are a queer and trans Muslim, and again, Muslim defined in whatever context makes the most sense for you, definitely feel free to also join us for programs. Also, if you wanted to do any offerings, we have kind of like an open door policy for queer and trans Muslims, where folks are able to do any kind of programs that they want, and we will get them paid. And so definitely highly encourage queer and trans Muslims to check us out, and reach out if y'all need anything. If y'all want to start things within your own communities, we're always happy to support. So those would be some of the ways to really interact with us.
And all of the links will be provided as well, y'all. So don't feel like you had to scramble to write anything down. We will get you all of the links. Yaffa, thank you so much for being here with me today. Is there anything else on your heart or your spirit that we didn't cover, or that you want to leave us with as a final note?
Yeah, I think the final thing, and this kind of goes back to those definitions that we were talking about early on with settler colonialism and things like that. Definitely do some work to really reflect on what those words mean, what those concepts are, and how they've shown up in the world. And then the other one that I want to invite folks to really interrogate is their concept of humanity. Because I tell people these days that if you need me to do something to prove my humanity to you, for me to be humanized, then our definitions are not in line. Because to me, humanity just is. We're human, period. There's nothing that you can do that moves you away from it, and there's nothing that you can do to move you towards it. And I would love that to become part of the discourse, instead of people asking me to do things to humanize myself. And I'm like, if you needed me to humanize myself in the first place, we're not there. We're not on the same page. I don't want that definition of humanity that you're keeping in your back pocket, because my definition includes everyone. Yeah. And I want to invite people to really reflect on that and really see how their definitions can become so much more expansive, in my opinion, as they should.
So I know I said we were going to wrap, but that's a great point. And so now I have follow-ups, because this is something I think about all the time, right? As I said, I was raised with a very clear understanding that humans are humans, and maybe you have to create distance from some humans based on the choices that they make and how they choose to treat other people. But at the baseline, everyone deserves that same level of respect, of honoring their personhood, all of those things. And so something that I know I struggle with is having that as a personal definition, and still realizing that so much of the world doesn't, right? To your point. And I think about this because a lot of these interviews that I'm doing is an attempt to try to get those people that don't have that definition to connect the dots to see we're not different. Actually, you are just a human being. And all of the nonsense that I have been taught and been programmed to believe is the thing standing between us, not anything about you and not anything about me. So with all of that being said, I'm wondering if you could, whether it's, leave some words for that person that needs that, right? That needs an interview of a person telling their personal story to be like, oh yeah, that's a person, right? That needs those things in order to see others as human. Is there something that you would say to that person?
I love this question. There's so much I would say. And in particular, I would ask that person to reflect on their own humanity. Because if you need someone to justify their existence to you, it means you're not at peace with your own, right? Because if you define humanity in a certain way of like, here's stipulations of this is what makes you human, that means you've created an entire world for yourself that you can never belong in. And so I think it just starts with people directly themselves. Right. This isn't about anybody else. It's the deep work that needs to happen just exists within you. And I always tell people always go back to basics, go back to the deepest of levels of, I think at times I tell people we complicate all the simple things and we simplify all the complicated things, right? Like we're messing up on both sides. And to me, so much of this is none of it is complicated. We don't need to know things. I don't need to know anything about you to fully honor your humanity. Yeah. And there is a beautiful video that Maya Angelou has, and I can send it to you later as well, where she talks about a quote from the philosopher Terence, way back from, I believe, the Greek Empire. And Terence talks about that there's nothing within humans that is foreign to any of us. So within every single one of us, we have all the building blocks for anything that any human has ever done. And I know that's a scary thought for people to think, right? So for me to think that I have the exact same building blocks that like Netanyahu has, right?
Yeah.
But she shares how profound that is, of that actually we do have every single thing. And so all of a sudden, anything that other people do becomes part of humanity. And the flip side of it, all of the things that you're looking at other people doing and you're like, wow, people are so amazing. Thinking of like the Martin Luther Kings of the world, right? And all these other people that you might be looking up to, you have those same building blocks too. And that is such a beautiful, profound definition instead of inherent good and evil and all of that is honestly just taking away from that we're all just human.
Yeah. I love that. That's beautiful. I really love that idea of you've created a world for yourself in which you don't belong, which inevitably, if you don't belong, how can anyone else? Right? So I love that as a directive to inquiry for self, right? Cool. Great. Thank you. Again, Yaffa, it has been a pleasure. Listeners, we'll get you all the links to the socials for Yaffa and MASGD and pre-order for the book. Again, I suggest maybe going back and listening to this one more time, maybe slowing it down a little, because there were just so many gems and so many important moments. And for yourself, as you're going back and listening, I really urge you all to, any of those questions that come up inside of you or anything that feels like it maybe is agitating a little bit or feels a little internally confrontational, write that down and get curious about that as well, because that is information for you to begin that internal dialogue and that internal conversation of, right, in terms of moving our needle towards equity, moving our internal selves towards collective liberation. Yaffa, again, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. That was incredibly regenerative. So I appreciate this.
Good. You're very welcome. All right, y'all. Until the next time.